Chapter 41, Third Year, Home Again.
Says burn, so send me away. Your minds are too green, I despise all I've seen. You can't stake your lives on a Saviour Machine.
Saturday, 1st September 1973. On the morning that Sirius finally returned to Hogwarts, his parents seemed to have decided that he existed again. His mother shouted at him to go back to his room and not return until he was dressed properly. His robes were purposely rumpled, his hair carefully mussed. She wouldn't let him leave until both her sons were the absolute picture of poise and decorum, which drove Sirius mad. Just a few more hours, he reminded himself, clinging to the fact that he would soon be free of his wretched family and reunited with his friends. He had spent the entire month of August counting down the days, feeling as though he might crawl out of his skin if he had to spend another second trapped in those awful holes. When he finally caught sight of platform 9 3/4, Sirius couldn't stop the broad grin that split his face in two. He could almost hear the crackle of the Gryffindor fireplace, could almost taste the feast. His mother grabbed his arm, digging her nails into his skin. "Don't go running off now," she hissed, quietly enough that none of the surrounding passers-by could hear. "We have an image to maintain." Sirius tried to wriggle out of her grasp, muttering, "What?" "We will go as a family, and you will board the train with your brother. Am I understood? There are appearances to keep up, boy, especially after that stunt your cousin pulled." She finally released him, and he rubbed his arm, grimacing. "Fine." Regulus stared at the ground, pointedly ignoring the exchange. Sirius scowled at him. He slouched against the station pillar once they were inside, mussing up his hair and re-rumpling his robes. His mother was too busy fawning over Reg to notice. She crouched down to smooth back his hair, whispering to him about family pride and remembering what he'd learned that summer, whatever that was supposed to mean. Regulus only nodded, white-faced, holding himself stiffly as if he had to concentrate to keep from drooping. The crowded station slowly emptied of people as students streamed onto the train, shouting goodbyes and waving to their families. While Berger waited until the last minute to send her sons off, brushing her lips against Regulus's forehead and acting as though Sirius were invisible. He rolled his eyes as he boarded, not even bothering to wave. In the narrow hallway, Reg hesitated for a moment. Sirius raised a brow. "Well, run along then. Haven't you missed all your creepy little friends?" His brother flushed. "We're supposed to sit together, yes, I know. They say that every year, but you made it very clear last year that you have no interest in sitting with my friends, and you're mental if you think I'm going to spend a single second in a Slytherin car." Reg looked as if he might say something, a dark expression clouding his face. But after a moment he just muttered, "Fine, do what you want." He spun on his heel and stormed off, as Sirius called after him, "I plan to." He spent a moment longer in the corridor, waiting for the anger to dissipate before finally hurrying off to find his friends. They had already found a carriage and settled down in their seats during the time it took him to disentangle himself from his family. Sirius pushed the door open, still irritated, muttering darkly, "Keeping up appearances, my arse." "No change, then?" James responded cheerfully. Sirius perked up immediately, smiling. He was finally back where he belonged. "I thought I'd never see you all again." "Godric, you always have to be so dramatic." James gave him a friendly punch on the shoulder as they all stood to greet him. "You don't know what she's like," Sirius insisted, clasping his friend's hand. James had grown a few inches over the summer, and his round face had sharpened a bit, but he still had the same warm smile. Sirius felt a jolt of surprise when Remus stood up. Previously the same height, his friend now towered over him. It looked as though someone had stretched him out. He stood even taller than James, who had always been the biggest in the group. "Is that you, Moony?" Sirius exclaimed, craning his neck comically and raising a hand as if to shield his eyes while he peered up. "Can you hear me up there?" "Ha ha," Remus said sourly, looking uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm the same height as James." "Not any more you're not," James shot back, standing closer so that they could all clearly see that Remus was a half-inch taller. "Yeah, how did I end up mates with two beanpoles, eh?" Sirius teased, slapping him on the back playfully. "Lucky I got you, eh, Petey boy?" Peter looked up from his pasty, oblivious. Unlike the others, he looked no taller than he had when they were all 11, though he was considerably wider. Sirius had grown a bit himself over the summer. It had happened so gradually that he hadn't realized until he noticed that his robes no longer brushed the ground when he put them on. He was secretly a bit jealous of his taller friends. He thought that their growth spurts made them look older, more mature. And wasn't he supposed to be the eldest? "Right," James rubbed his hands together as they all sat down. "Now all that's out the way, I say we move on to new business. Plans for the year?" "We have to finish the map," Remus said eagerly. "It's not far off, and I bet we could figure out that homunculus charm if we really put the effort in." "Definitely," James agreed. "The map is basically our legacy, right? We'll work on it, I promise." "And that other thing," Sirius jumped in, raising his eyebrows meaningfully. Left alone with little to do, Sirius had spent most of his free time researching over the summer. He felt confident that he had mapped out every detail of the animagus process, and was sure that the marauders would be able to do it. Well, he and James would at least. In his letters with James, he'd suggested that they break the news to Remus, but James held off, insisting that they wait until they were absolutely certain that the task was feasible. "What other thing?" Remus asked, frowning. James shot Sirius an irritated glance before turning to their friend. "Just something we were talking about last year. We'll let you know if we decide to go through with it." "Don't want you to get into trouble, Moony." Peter forced a nervous laugh. "Less you know the better, eh?" Remus looked annoyed, and Sirius didn't blame him. He wished the others would just let him come clean. But he'd been outvoted, and although he didn't agree with James's decision, he still trusted his friend. Still, he shot the others a meaningful look as Remus turned to stare out the window, sulking. After a few more minutes of conversation, Peter sighed heavily. "Where's the trolley witch? I'm hungry." "I just saw you finish a pasty," James said irritably. He'd been in the middle of explaining his plan to bewitch the Slytherin team's brooms at their next Quidditch practice, and didn't appreciate the interruption. "Yeah, but I fancy something sweet," Peter whined, searching his pockets and finding only empty wrappers. Remus perked up, finally looking away from the window. "I've got you sorted, Pete," he said casually, digging in his suitcase. He pulled out a handful of colorful and unfamiliar chocolate bars, dumping them unceremoniously on the seat beside him. Sirius stared, studying the bright wrappers and reading the funny names. "What are these?" He picked up one with bold red text that just said Mars, wondering if it had anything to do with Ziggy Stardust and the spiders. "Muggle chocolate," Remus said. "They're good. Go on, won't bite." Peter had unwrapped one before Remus even had the chance to finish speaking, and grinned with his mouth full, nodding encouragingly. Sirius tore open his own bar, excited. He had never tasted Muggle chocolate before. They spent the rest of the train ride digging through the pile and opening one of everything, passing them around so they could all take bites. The great hall was just as grand as always. Mahogany tables laid out with silver dishes for the feast, and candelabras flickering with warm light. They had just settled down into their seats when Lily Evans came marching over. She plopped down next to Remus, who looked a bit surprised to see her, and said, "You're taking runes, aren't you, Remus?" She'd gotten a haircut over the summer, and she tilted her head to the side to nudge the soft fringe out of her eyes. "Yup." He towered over her, even sitting down. "Moony's abandoning us," Sirius wailed dramatically, falling onto James's shoulder with an exaggerated motion and pretending to sob uncontrollably. "There, there," James played along, patting his back solemnly. "I hope you're happy, Remus. All very well, you moving on to bigger and better things, but think about us little people you're leaving behind." Remus flushed, the way he often did when he was the center of attention. "I'm not leaving anyone behind," he muttered. "Just didn't fancy divination." "Ignore them," Lily said primly. She was always acting like she was so above it all, but this only encouraged Sirius and James, and they mock-wept hysterically as if Remus was breaking both their hearts. Lily tutted, obviously irritated, and turned back to the tall boy. "You lot don't have to be attached at the hip all the time. Anyway, I'm doing runes too. Have you done the pre-reading?" Sirius felt like rolling his eyes. It was Remus. Of course he'd done the pre-reading. Sure enough, he nodded. "Yeah, it actually looks really interesting." Sirius felt a twinge of annoyance that their friend was actually ignoring them in favor of talking to Lily Evans. He knew Remus was mental, but there was no way that the pre-reading for ancient runes was actually that fascinating. He glanced between the two of them slyly. "Aha!" Sirius interrupted the conversation. "Now I see." Remus finally swung around to look at him, nervous. "What?" "I don't think it has anything to do with furthering your academic career," Sirius declared. "I think that our dear Moony has been lured away from everyone's favorite DOS subject by the fairer sex." "Shut up," Remus said, blushing so hard that the freckles dotting his face looked like strawberry seeds. He was purposely avoiding Lily's gaze, and Sirius felt a twinge of anxiety. Remus didn't actually fancy her, did he? Sirius wasn't sure what he'd do if both his best mates had a crush on Lily Bloody Evans. The woman of the hour shot him a dirty look. "Yeah, shut up, Black," she sighed. "Honestly, you lot can't even be nice to each other. Just because no girls would come near you with a 5-foot barge pole, I'll have you know I was very recently engaged to be married," Sirius replied swiftly, swishing his dark hair. James could hardly breathe from laughing so hard, snorting as he tried to catch his breath. "What else are you taking, Remus?" Lily ploughed on, determined to ignore the other marauders. "Care of Magical Creatures," Remus said with a resigned sigh. James and Sirius had been teasing him about it ever since they turned in their timetables. "Ooh!" Marlene said suddenly. "Me and Mary are taking that." "Aha!" Sirius crowed triumphantly, and James fell to pieces next to him. Their teasing was cut short as the sorting ceremony began. Sirius kept his eyes on the table, fiddling with his silverware as the nervous first-years were called one by one to the rickety old stool. He didn't watch. The old hat still made him uncomfortable. He had nightmares sometimes about the way it had felt on his head, heavy and warm, like a throat opening up to swallow. Nobody else seemed to mind it much, but the dusty old thing gave Sirius the creeps. He was relieved when it ended, ready to dig into the delicious feast the moment it appeared. Remus had double portions of everything. Sirius and James laughed at the shock on Lily's face as she watched him eat. When it was over, the hall was buzzing with happy chatter, tables full of smiling students. And then Dumbledore got up to give his speech. He gave one every year, Sirius usually only half paid attention, as it was typically the same pithy, feel-good sentiments that any headmaster would remark at the opening of a school year. But this year was different. Dumbledore looked grave as he spoke about unity in the face of hardship, acceptance in the face of difference, courage in the face of doubt. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, and Sirius felt his stomach twisting into hard little knots. "What was all that about?" Remus asked as they began to file out of the hall. "Unity in the face of darkness and all that." "Oh, right, you wouldn't know," James said, voice low. Sirius could feel his friend glancing at him, but he kept his eyes down, hands shoved into his pockets. He had a pretty good idea about the darkness that their headmaster was referring to. James hesitated a moment, then said, "Tell you when we're alone, okay?" They waited to get the year's password, Codswallop, and headed straight up the stairs to their familiar dorm room. It was in pristine condition, neatly made beds, standing guard over carefully packed trunks. Sirius moved immediately to unpack, fishing through James's trunk for his precious Muggle records and books. It had been a very long summer without Bowie. James pulled his broom out and settled down cross-legged on his bed, polishing it religiously. For a moment, no one spoke. "So?" Remus prompted. "The weird speech?" "Oh, yeah." James swallowed, glancing at Sirius again. He ignored it, let James explain what was going on to their friend, if he had to. Sirius didn't want to think about it. "It's all politics, really," James said carefully. This didn't seem to satisfy Remus. He repeated, "Politics?" He waited expectantly for the other boy to explain. "Well, you know there are, dark wizards?" "Yeah." "There's been a surge in dark magic lately, that's all. My dad told me. There's some stuff going on at the ministry. Department heads pushing for stricter reforms against Muggle-born wizards and people who are different. Dad said it was nothing to worry about, just the usual old prejudices. But I suppose Dumbledore thinks we need to be on guard." The usual old prejudices. Sirius thought of his family gatherings, work meetings, dinner parties. He thought of the cold disgust in his parents' voices when they spoke about Muggles and Muggle-born wizards. He thought about his relatives ranting about the ministry politicians and the need for reforms after bottles of wine were passed around. He thought about politics, always politics. There's been a surge in dark magic lately. Mother and Father called a meeting. He heard the words leave his mouth, as if he was speaking from underwater. He could feel his friend's eyes on him. They wouldn't let me in, obviously. I'm not like them. But Reg went. They're ruining him, and I don't know how to stop it. They keep talking about this Dark Lord. I don't know, maybe a politician they want to back in the next election. I hated him for leaving me and for shutting the door behind him, and I hated that I was on the other side of it. I hated that I wanted them to let me in. All I know is that if the blacks are supporting him, then he can't be good." He let the words sit, bait in a trap. He wanted them to say something, wanted them to agree or disagree, to levy judgment one way or the other. He wanted them to say, "Your family are dark wizards," so that he could say, "I know, and I hate them, and I'm not like them, I promise, I don't care about them." Or maybe he'd say, "You don't know what you're talking about, you don't get to decide that, they're not evil, they're really, really not." Either way, it would be spoken aloud. The words would become something physical, something he could pulp between his teeth and digest, instead of just an unsaid ghost in his throat. But nobody spoke. Finally, Peter broke the silence. "We're at Hogwarts," he said. "My mum always said that Hogwarts is the safest place in Britain, and we've got Dumbledore." He spoke firmly, as if he was settling something. "Come on, Black. Bet you've got another awful Muggle record that you're just dying to assault our ears with." It wasn't what he wanted, but in the moment Sirius was stupidly grateful for Peter. He even managed to grin. "Actually," he turned back to the record player, dusting it off, I have.